So how do these web applications work? There seems to be, first of all, some confusion about that. So let's have a look at that. So first of all, there seems to be a bit of confusion about this whole client-server thing. So how does a web page work and how does a web application work? So a web page, basically just an HTML file, but normally when you open a web page, you will actually go to open it as from a web server somewhere else, some computer somewhere else, because you don't want to download everything and then only load it. No, you want to see it, what it's currently there. Otherwise, before you can look at the news, you have to first go and use some program to download the news and then open it. That's not nice. We want to go to, say, www.bbc.co.uk/news. And then that opens that, what in web terminology is called a resource. So a resource lives at a particular resource location, and you can find that with a resource locator URL. And what happens if you do that is that your web browser will go and gets the resource that is identified by that location and then reads that and then says, okay, this is HTML, I know what to do with this. I'm going to make the graphical representation of this so that it looks good. Of course, to make it look good, it has CSS as well, and it can even have JavaScript to add more functionality. So if there's JavaScript, it will not only load it, it will also execute that JavaScript. And that's kind of how it fits together. So the web page ties everything together into one document. The web page comes from a web server that provides the web page and the JavaScript and the CSS file, because you normally want them all from the same file. At least the web page tells you where to find the JavaScript and the CSS. And yes, you can also have inline JavaScript, but you don't really want to do that for anything significant. So when we look at it from a web application perspective, what we have is an application that where we actually say, rather than having everything being sent as a web page by the server. By the way, this does not have to be a file. This can be generated by the server on demand. It's a resource. What's underlying that resource? The browser doesn't care. It just says, give me the resource. And then the server provides that resource whatever way it finds appropriate. That can be by giving it a file or by creating the HTML content on the fly. So make sure that you understand that there's a difference between the contents provided and the physical artifact of a file that contains those contents. So yes, a web page presents a set of contents that link with an HTML file, but it doesn't have to be an HTML file. File has to do with how you store it, but it doesn't have to be stored. It can be generated on the fly. Maybe your browser stores it temporarily in a cache to keep it working. But still, at some point, you might want to say, okay, I want to actually, rather than going to hit the server and then getting back and then having a refresh, that can get a really jarring experience. Sometimes it's much nicer as if you make some request that it just updates the page then and there. That is what a dynamic page does effectively. It is where JavaScript changes the displayed page. It does this by manipulating the document object, which is according to a standard called the document object model. So there's a standard document object that gives you the web page in JavaScript that you can manipulate however you want. And if you look at your browser's inspection thing, the developer inspection, it will display you the current DOM. What is important to think about this here is that what happens is that your browser receives the web resource. Let's not call it a file, a resource. That resource gets then parsed into HTML or into an in-memory representation, the document object model. That could be either because it can be parsed from HTML or from XHTML, so an XML serialization of HTML, which has some slightly different rules. You can do either. In HTML5, both are allowed, and they have, where possible, the same semantics, same meaning. So this HTML document gets translated into this in-memory representation, and that in-memory representation is the document, or the document object model, the DOM tree, we call it generally, because it is in the structure of a tree, like an HTML document is a tree form, with things nested inside each other. So at some point you have only leaves left. So that is so, and then what happens then? It's like part of when it does it. It says, oh, hey, here's a CSS file. If you put it in the right location, your browser will pick it up and say, oh, there's your header. Here's a link to a CSS file. Let's add that to the CSS files I need to evaluate in the right way. And also, if it sees JavaScript, it will actually go and try and run that JavaScript, especially if it's in the body. And you can even create HTML directly in your JavaScript code. You don't necessarily want to do it that way by doing document.write. That's a very old-fashioned way because it makes your pages a bit slow, and it disables certain optimizations your browser can do. So that's not necessarily the way you want to do it. Basically, JavaScript is just a bit of a program that you can run in the context of your web page. So it has this document model, it has this CSS, and you can also interrogate the CSS. There's a CSS object model as well that you can access. But if you want to set a CSS file, you can just even set it in the HTML using JavaScript, and that will just make it work. So the browser works from this in-memory document object model, not from whatever file was originally sent over or whatever resource. And this is what a dynamic application kind of uses.